learners, and welcome to the 45th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have covered quite a diverse range of poets and their work in this course so far. Today, we will embark on a journey examining the life and work of a very, very moving, powerful, but not actually very prolific poet. The name of this poet is Elizabeth Bishop, and we will spend some time understanding the life and writing of this person. I will first make some prefatory comments discussing some aspects of Bishop's life and some aspects of her style before going on to reading about 4 or 5 of her poems. So, Elizabeth Bishop can be situated along the great fault line of 20th century Anglophone poetry. By this, I mean that Elizabeth Bishop's work allows us to see the lines or the separations or the key binary oppositions which can help us understand almost all of the major poetry that was written in English in the 20th century. What is this fault line or what is this binary opposition? We can define it as an opposition between modernists and confessionals. There is one group of poets whose writing we can identify as modernist, and another group of poets whose writing we can call confessional. And the unique thing about Elizabeth Bishop is that her writing draws on both, but belongs to or fits into neither. Bishop was influenced by by poets from both these groups, but it is impossible to categorize her work as belonging to or fitting into either of these. Why is that? This is because her work is less abstract and more attuned to the delicate, the ordinary, the peculiar, and the particular than, say, the work of T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, or Marianne Moore. I'm identifying these 3 poets, Eliot, Stevens, and Moore, as representative and exemplary of the first group, that is, that of modernists. As I have mentioned on repeated occasions in this course, by modernist, I mean an attention to form and a knowledge of the history of poetry as something that's to be known intellectually to the poet. The style of writing had a connotation of being elitist, mainly because poets who wrote in this vein and who believed in poetry in this way often wrote in a way that was not very accessible to common readers. Often an appreciation and an understanding of poems written by modernists required a knowledge of the history of English poetry. It also required the energy to endlessly decode and solve the mystery. So to look for clues as to the meaning of poems. And there was a sense in which difficulty, the difficulty of understanding poetry was not seen as a problem, but rather as a virtue or a feature of good poetry. Difficulty was a good thing. It was supposed to be enjoyed and appreciated. Poets who wrote in this way and whose poems were received in this way, I'm calling modernists. And there is something in Bishop's writing which allows us to see that Bishop was influenced by this group, by this style of writing, by this expectation from readers to perceive and receive her poetry in a certain way. However, that is not the full story, and there are poems by Elizabeth Bishop in which we can find a different sort of influence. The influence of another group of poets, poets like John Berryman, Robert Lowell, or Anne Sexton. These poets I have named somewhat arbitrarily, but the reason for that is that these poets often wrote about biographical matters, often autobiographical or about the lives of people very close to them. Uh, so, because of the close proximity and the direct correspondence between life and poetry, I'm calling these poets confessional. There is a lot in Elizabeth Bishop's poems which can be called confessional, but there is a very elegant balancing act that Elizabeth Bishop's poems perform between these two styles. While Bishop is inspired by modernists, Bishop takes the modernist style and makes it a little bit confessional. On the other hand, Elizabeth takes the confessional style and makes it a bit modernist. So, the key to understanding the power, the beauty, and the uh, poignance of Elizabeth Bishop's poems is to see the poet as straddling a very tightrope, as walking a tightrope and balancing two opposed sensibilities. Now, one case in point, and I will read from two collections of poetry. The first is Elizabeth Bishop's first collection that was published, titled North and South. This volume was published in the year 1946. It was published after a decade of writing when the author was 35. And this is perhaps one of the very few well-known collections that Bishop published. While Bishop published several book-length volumes, not all of them contain new poems. And Bishop is remarkable for publishing very few poems in her lifetime. One scholar has counted the number of poems published in her lifetime as about 101. So, this is a remarkable fact for a poet who is today known as among the most powerful and the most influential poets of the 20th century, at least in America. Other poets who achieved this kind of influence, acclaim, and respect that Bishop enjoys today began publishing very early and kept publishing actively, frequently, and prolifically. Bishop, however, was notoriously slow and extremely painstaking with her writing and publishing. And one scholar has counted the average time that Bishop took to write poems that would be published as approximately 1 to 2 poems per year. So, this average, of course, is not very applicable, and statistics is not a very good way to understand poetry, but it just gives us some idea of the kind of approach that this person had towards writing and how they understood and went about their task of writing poems. Now, this average, the fact that Bishop took about a year to compose about 1 to 2 poems, stands in stark contrast to that of her contemporaries, senior and junior, who were known to complete a single collection's worth of poems in about 3 to 4 months. A very good example of such a contemporary is Sylvia Plath, who completed half the poems which would become Ariel in about a month. So Bishop, on the other hand, took 11 years to complete North and South. This number and this duration might seem excessive and might seem quite amazing, but even this number pales in comparison to the number of years and the amount of time Bishop took to arrive at a publishable version of a poem titled The Moose. The Moose was a poem that Bishop began writing at the time that her first collection, North and South, was published, But this poem was not published until the end of her career in her final collection, that is Geography 3. So 26 years it took for this poem from the day it began to be composed to the day it appeared in print. I will now take a few moments to take a brief detour and give you all a sense of this poem, Moose. This poem, as I mentioned, appeared in Geography the Third, the final collection that Elizabeth Bishop published. It in fact appeared after her collected poems had appeared in the year 1970. And this was a time when Elizabeth Bishop was recognized all over the literary world as a force to be reckoned with. In the year 1970, she had joined the faculty of Harvard University as a professor of poetry and had already won the National Book Award for Poetry for her collected poems. So, writing from a position of a great deal of influence, acclaim, and respect, Bishop took out from her drawer a poem that she had been composing from her earliest days. The Moose was written when she was traveling between North and South. I will explain the North and South relevance a little bit later. But first, I want us all to get a sense of this poet, her style, her attitudes towards life, towards movement, and towards nature by reading through this poem, The Moose. The Moose by Elizabeth Bishop. From narrow provinces of fish and bread and tea, home of the long tides where the bay leaves the sea twice a day and takes the herrings long rides, where if the river enters or retreats in a wall of brown foam, depends on if it meets. The bay coming in, the bay not at home, where silted red sometimes the sun sets, facing a red sea, and others veins the flats, lavender, rich mud in burning rivulets. So these three stanzas are describing a place from where the speaker of this poem is moving. So we know that from one word which begins the poem, which is from narrow provinces. So narrow provinces, the word narrow and the word province both describe a particular kind of place. A province is the opposite of a metropolis. A province is less developed, less populated, less culturally vibrant, and somewhat rural, somewhat less civilized, somewhat used to older technologies, older forms of social organization. And so she is referring to a place which is a narrow province. And then we are given a lot of details about the natural beauty and setting of this place. How the sun hits the landscape, how the sea and the river interact with the land, and then how the colors change at different times of the day. Further, the poet describes, on red gravelly roads down rows of sugar maples, past clapboard farmhouses and neat clapboard churches, bleached, ridged as clamshells, past twin silver birches. So she's passing a lot of things. Passing means moving, while these things are stationary. So we get a sense that the poet is in motion. The speaker of these lines is describing things, but these things are being left behind while the speaker is moving forward. And the speaker is moving away from a space of provinciality, rural settings, natural settings, and not very civilized or not very metropolitan societies, because we are told that there is a lot of clapboard buildings. Clapboard, not solid wood, but clapboard. Right? So board is cheap, loose, somewhat flimsy, somewhat easy to construct, somewhat hastily put together, all of which gives the indication that this is a fairly recent development, that these buildings have been put together very recently. This is a new and young civilization. Further, the poet goes, through late afternoon, a bus journeys west, the windshield flashing pink, pink glancing off of metal, brushing the dented flank of blue beat-up enamel. So now we learn more about where exactly the speaker of these lines is situated physically. The speaker of these lines is inside a bus. The speaker is taking a bus journey from one place to another. We don't know where she's going to, but we know where she's coming from. All of these stanzas have been describing the place, and it has several features. Now, this stanza describes some features of the mode of transport which is helping the speaker of these lines move. There is metal, there's dented flank of blue, there's beat up enamel. So it's a bus that has been put through a great deal of travel. It's a bus that makes this journey on a regular basis, and due to these frequent journeys, the physical structure of the bus has developed certain abrasions, certain wear and tear, the evidence of frequent and regular exposure to the road and the elements that the road carries. So sun, rain, wind, snow, dust, motion, friction. A lot of these things have taken their toll on the body of the bus, but the bus keeps going. It is a regular, sustained, persevering motion, and this gives the poet a great deal of stability. Further, down hollows, up rises, and waits patient while a lone traveler gives kisses and embraces to 7 relatives and a collie supervisors. So the poet now is observing the bus as an agent. The bus is performing certain actions. It is moving down hollows and up rises. It is waiting patiently while people bid their goodbyes. So there is one example of a particular family saying goodbye to one member, and we see that there is one person who is leaving, and there are 7 people who are seeing the traveler off at the bus stop. The bus waits while this group of people performs its goodbye rituals. And the poet adds, with her keen eye of observation, that in addition to these 7 people saying goodbye, there is also an animal. There is a collie. A collie is a dog, and the dog is supervising this goodbye ritual. So it's a very keen observation about not only what people do, but also the dynamic of how families operate, and also how a pet dog plays a very key and very powerful role in the organization and the conveyance of family relationships. The dog supervises goodbyes, right? So this is a keen observation about the empathetic and ethical role that animals play, especially domesticated pet animals in human societies. Further, goodbye to the elms, to the farm, to the dog, the bus starts. The light grows richer, the fog, shifting, salty, thin, comes closing in. So now there's a shift in the poem from a general description of where the poet was moving from. The poet is now describing the beginning of a particular journey. One person has said goodbye and has allowed the bus to start moving. Now the poet focuses on another agent. From the bus, the poet has shifted to the fog. Its cold round crystals form and slide and settle in the white hen's feathers, in grey glazed cabbages, on the cabbage roses, and lupins like apostles. So the snow and the fog, right? there is a constant change as the temperature rises and falls. The moisture in the air, it freezes and melts as the bus moves through different climates, and as the poet very keenly keeps observing these things. The poet observes how the fog settles as frozen crystals of snow in the between the feathers of hens and in gray glazed cabbages. Right? So the poet has a pastoral imagination. The poet is very sensitive to the details of the natural and the agricultural world. Further, sweet peas cling to their wet white string on the whitewashed fences. Bumblebees creep inside the foxgloves, and evening commences. One stop at Bass River, then the economies, lower, middle, upper, 5 islands, 5 houses, where a woman shakes a tablecloth out after supper. So these are all the names of locations, localities, and villages, some towns in the area of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is in Canada. It is just north of the US-Canada border, and it's a semi-rural area. So the poet is observing details of life in this Canadian semi-rural setting. And the poet is observing not only natural beauty, but also the division of labor within human households. There is a woman who's shaking a tablecloth out after supper. So everyone has eaten, but it is the woman who is shaking the tablecloth. This is an empathetic gaze that the poet has cast, and the poet is reflecting on the solitude and the labor of this woman who is arranging and undertaking domestic labor after others have eaten and left. Further, a pale flickering gone, the Tantramar marshes and the smell of salt hay, an iron bridge trembles and loose plank rattles, but doesn't give way. On the left, a red light swims through the dark, a ship's port lantern, 2 rubber boots show, illuminated, solemn, a dog gives 1 bark. So this stanza is testament to the sharpness as well as the keenness of the poet's eye. The poet's eye wanders from left to right, from east to west, all across the windows of the bus, inside which she's traveling. Now, having described scenes in the countryside, scenes outside people's houses, the poet turns her gaze towards the coast. And at sea, the poet spots a ship which is moving towards the coast, about to port. And here the poet sees rubber boots and a dog owned by one of the sailors on the ship. Again, the journey continues. A woman climbs in with 2 market bags, brisk, freckled, elderly. A grand night, yes, sir, all the way to Boston. She regards us amicably. Now, for the first time in several stanzas, we receive a hint as to the destination, or at least if not the final destination, the direction in which the bus and the poet are moving. We get this from a clue given by one of the passengers. The poet is already settled, but the poet witnesses other passengers enter the bus and give their destination, probably to the conductor, so they can buy a ticket. This person who says all the way to Boston suggests that wherever else the poet might be planning to get off, the bus has one destination. The destination of this bus, the place where the bus will stop moving and change direction after a break to return, that place is Boston. So we now get a sense of what kind of an itinerary this bus is undertaking. The itinerary is from the north to south. South, in this case, is Boston. Now, for an American imagination of geography, Boston is pretty far in the north of the US. But from the perspective of the poet and from the perspective of the speaker of this poem, Boston is south. Why? Because the journey that begins is from even further north, that is, an area that is north of the US Canada border. Further, moonlight as we enter the New Brunswick woods, hairy, scratchy, splintery, moonlight and mist caught in them like lamb's wool on bushes in a pasture. So, again, striking metaphors where images of light are combined with images of livestock, the hair on the body of certain animals, like lamb's wool. A very striking image, one that can be produced only by a poet who has observed a great deal of details very sharply and has thought deeply about the relationship between different images. This also tells us that Bishop was deeply inspired by the metaphysical poets, especially John Donne, and who was always trying in her own writing to produce the kind of effect that we read about in T.S. Eliot's description of the metaphysical poets. Eliot's distinction between metaphysical poets and Victorian or Romantic era poets was that for a lot of the inferior poetry, emotions were detached from images or thoughts. And in the work of T.S. Eliot, in the writing of T.S. Eliot, in Eliot's argument for the virtues of metaphysical poetry, it was the metaphysical poet, like John Donne, who were able to combine thoughts and emotions. And this is exactly what we see in Bishop's writing. Moonlight, right? The way the moonlight hits different natural surroundings is described as the kind of wool that can be found on the body of a lamb. Further, the passengers lie back, snores, some long sighs, dreamy divergation, that is, wanderings, begins in the night, a gentle, auditory, slow hallucination. In the creakings and noises, an old conversation, not concerning us, but recognizable, somewhere, back in the bus, grandparents' voices, uninterruptedly talking, in eternity, names being mentioned, things cleared up finally, what he said, what she said, who got pensioned, deaths and sicknesses, the year he remarried, the year something happened, she died in childbirth, that was the son lost when the schooner foundered. So now something else has happened. The light has passed, the sun has set, the bus continues moving on its fixed path. So because it is dark now, the poet can no longer observe the sights and some of the sounds and the changing natural beauty outside the windows of the bus. Additionally, another thing has happened. The landscape itself has changed. Because the night has begun, the passengers have settled in. Passengers have become less active. They have become dormant. The poet hears snores. The poet hears long sighs. Passengers trying to get some rest, knowing that they have nothing to do but to wait until the bus makes its way to Boston. In this dark, quiet space, the poet discerns voices. What are these voices? Two passengers who have not slept and who are whispering out of respect for those who are trying to sleep or rest. The poet guesses that it is an old couple, probably grandparents, and they are talking about their life. They are talking about their children. They are talking about all the human beings who matter to them and who have gone through a wide range of pain, suffering, joys, as well as comforts. And one of the things that this couple mentions is someone who died in childbirth, someone who drowned when a ship sank, and several other things. But essentially, what they're doing, they're taking stock of their life. They're taking a moment to remind each other of what matters, and they're taking a moment to remind each other of how they can cope with the changing world around them, what remains the same, what they can hold on to, and how they can continue to live sustainably. And this conversation continues. The poem is a bit long, so I will stop here and I will resume reading this poem and wrapping up this poem as well as continuing our discussion of Elizabeth Bishop in the next lecture. Thank you.